Hi everyone, welcome again to Inside Infrastructure. I'm Adrian Dwyer from Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Ilya Zak from our series sponsor PwC Australia's Infrastructure and Urban Renewal team. How you doing, Ilya?
I'm pretty well, Adrian. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm right.
It's great to be here today. Another election wrapped up last week. It's proving to be a pretty exciting time to be in the infrastructure sector. Infrastructure has formed the main talking point for the election for both parties, and it was an exciting debate.
I'm probably a nerd. It's always an exciting time in infrastructure for me, but it has been particularly exciting with the elections we've had and are having. So there's a federal election most likely around the 11th or the 18th of May. So we've just had the New South Wales election. We'll have the federal election soon.
It is coming up soon, and in that context for today, we've just had a fascinating discussion with our special guest on the show, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, former Deputy Leader and Infrastructure Minister during the last Labor government, and currently the Shadow Minister for Transport and Infrastructure.
That's right, and I from my perspective, really enjoyed the discussion. I suspect you did as well, Ilya. He's obviously passionate about the infrastructure space. He's been in the portfolio for 12 years as a minister and a shadow, and a really frank discussion about what goes on in Canberra, what the opportunities and challenges are. Absolutely,
it was fascinating. And so without further ado, here he is, Anthony Albanese.
Right, Anthony Albanese, thank you for joining us here on Inside Infrastructure.
Good to be here.
Oh, good to have you. Affectionately known as Albo, sometimes people mispronounce it as Albanese. You've been a former Deputy Prime Minister, former Minister, so you're also the Honourable. How should we address you?
Anthony's fine.
Anthony. Not Albo? We can't say
Albo's
Albo.
Fine too.
Right. And what's your DJ name?
DJ Albo, obviously.
DJ Albo.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I was on the sideline of my son's football game a couple of years ago, and they were all chanting out, Albo. And I realised then that my now 18-year-old son, once he hit 16, is now known as Albo as well. So
Oh no,
it's a name that sticks.
So you, as a kid, people called you Albo?
As a kid, absolutely everyone called me Albo, from primary school all the way through, and it's just stuck. And it didn't stick in politics. My friends called me Albo, but people in Canberra didn't. Actually, one of the people who started it, I think, was Malcolm Turnbull, used to call me that. And then Kevin Rudd, when the leadership changed in 2013 and I became Deputy Prime Minister, he introduced me to the world as Deputy Prime Minister Albo at the press conference late on the Wednesday night. And that just meant it stuck from that point on.
That's it. So since 2013,
that was it. So
you're Albo.
Absolutely, I always have been, but now it's very broad. And people who I've never met, it used to make me feel a little bit uncomfortable. But people I've never met will go, "Hi, Albo," and I guess it's quite nice. It's a sign of affection, I like to think.
Can you get Albo put on the ballot paper?
If you've got it. Unfortunately not, but we do have, we have had T-shirts from time to time that just have on it Albo rather than the full name. And it is what it is. It works. And I do take it as a sign of approachability, which hopefully I am. I think I'm a pretty friendly person. And if people feel comfortable with calling me Albo, I think that means they're comfortable with having a chat.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about what Albo is short for?
Albanese is the correct pronunciation,
right.
Of course. You always say the vowels at the end of Italian words,
That's right.
But I've said before I'm not terribly precious about how people pronounce my name. No one says Bolognese when they order spaghetti Bolognese, but they should, of course. And it's a bit more of a silent S, really, when you do the proper Italian. Yeah. Albanese.
Your father was Italian, is that right?
My father was Italian, and so hence I got his name.
Okay, and you don't speak it yourself?
No. My people need to buy the book by Karen Middleton, Albanese, telling it straight. That tells the story about my origins, which is my father's contribution was pretty minimal to my early life. My mum travelled overseas as a very brave young woman in the early 60s. My mum's name was Ellery, Mary Ann Ellery, and she travelled overseas. Her brother was working on the Fair Sky, a cruise ship. He was an entertainer, and she went overseas with him. She met my father. They had a relationship, both on the ship and when it came back. She was living in London, so she went down and visited him in Southampton, and we suspect that's where I was conceived. So
You don't have any secret European citizenship, do you?
she, well, no. In terms of my birth certificate has a blank
Right.
next to my father, because my mum told him that she'd fallen pregnant. He was engaged to someone from his local town in Puglia, in Italy, Barletta, and she came back. And of course, it was a difficult decision to have a child out of wedlock in 1963. So I was told, as was the neighbours and the community around Camperdown, she was very Catholic, and that he died. And the original plan was that he had died, and then she had lost me in childbirth for me to be adopted out, which was very common in those days. Women would go for a holiday in the country for 6 months and come back.
Right.
And my mother was handed her young son after I was born at St Margaret's Hospital there in Darlinghurst. The nuns knew that she didn't want to give me up, and so she kept me, and it was a very brave thing to do. But I grew up being told that my father had died. She told me when I was a teenager, and I just dealt with that. I had grown up in a two-person household, so I didn't feel a need to search for him at the time. She had raised me and been everything for me, and I think out of respect for her as well, she needed to hear that she was enough, which she was. So later on in life, though, she died in 2002. My son came along in 2000, and there was a particular time we were at my mum's grave out at Rookwood, and he asked me where my father was, and the truth is I didn't know.
Right.
And I then embarked on a search for him, and I found him with the assistance of some others in December 2009. So we met then. It took quite a while, and it was really very lucky. We found his employment records in a box on a wharf in Genoa. And that had an address where I had his birth date. I thought he was from Naples, which is the other side of Italy from where he was from, but that was a port city. So we found an address and made contact, and I met him and my half brother and half sister, and we had to convince them firstly that I wasn't after anything. I wasn't there for the inheritance or anything else as his firstborn. My father passed away in January 2014, and up until that point, people weren't aware of my story. But Karen Middleton, the journalist, knew about it and was determined to write a story. Originally, she wanted to do a TV thing. She was working for SBS, but decided to put it in long form. And once my father had passed away, I didn't tell anyone while my mother was alive, out of respect for her. I mean,
Sure.
it's a tough thing. It says something about the pressure that was placed on young women in that region that, she adopted his name. She had this story. She wore a wedding and engagement ring as a widow, all of which was because somehow judgment was made of even the term illegitimate. I mean, think about what that means. You're not as good as someone who's legitimate.
Yeah.
And I mean, really, I think it was a very courageous decision that she took. And
it's quite a selfless one as well, because that was for
absolutely.
you. As,
She gave up an enormous amount.
That age at which your mum told you about your father and you said teenage years?
Yeah, I was about 15 or 16.
So is that similar time to when you were getting interested in politics and?
Yeah,
Labour?
I joined the Labor Party at that age. I grew up in a household. I say I was raised by my mother with three faiths: the Catholic Church, South Sydney Rugby League Football Club, and the Australian Labor Party.
And your mum was?
My mum was a member. My grandfather was a member. The family were all Labor. I grew up in there was council housing, city council housing. My grandfather was a printer and did printing for Pat Hills, who was a former leader of the Labor Party here in New South Wales. The family was just Labor. It was the community around the city council was all industrial, with this one block of housing that was all public housing, whereby everyone supported rugby league, everyone was Catholic, and everyone voted Labor. So
you didn't have a chance.
That's
really.
That's just what you did. That was part of the culture.
Yeah.
And it was a close-knit community, not without some internal issues, as happens, but it was very much a close-knit community. We never had a car or anything, so my life existed between Camperdown and the city.
You a good kid at school, or?
I was not the most studious kid. I did okay at school, but I was a bit of a knockabout kid too. My mum had rheumatoid arthritis and was very crippled up with that, and then with consequent health issues that came from being on various medication, etc. So there wasn't an organ that she didn't have issues with. So she spent a lot of time in hospital. So, from the age of 12, I was living by myself for considerable periods of time, getting meals from the neighbours, cooked dinner, but looking after, going to the hospital, picking up my mum's washing, doing that, paying the rent, looking after the household.
It sounds like that experience has shaped your membership of the Labor Party more than, or at least as much as it just being the inherited membership as well.
Oh, absolutely. It was one of the first campaign I was involved with was the civic reform, which was basically the Conservatives got control of the city council and wanted to sell all the housing up. Mm-hmm. So my first campaign, I was very young, early teens, 12, 13, was going around knocking on doors, getting petitions. We had a rent strike that lasted for over a year. My first public speeches would have been as a 13-year-old kid or at mass meetings opposed to privatisation of public housing.
It strikes me that all of those issues that politicised you, they're all state issues, not federal issues, or at least they're state issues now. And yet, you've been Deputy Prime Minister, Federal Minister, you've spent your at least the last couple of decades dealing with federal issues. Is that an active decision, or?
I think the way you change the country is in the national parliament. And increasingly what we've seen just with the way that the world's changed is that trend will continue. The national government will have more influence.
Can I dig in on that a little? So it sounds like that's quite a passionate interest for
Absolutely.
you. So housing, and as Adrian mentioned, those are, at the moment, those are largely state issues, but you have chosen, and you're the infrastructure guy for the Labor Party. But I guess it's infrastructure that you've been drawn to. There's a bit of a disconnect there. Can you help us make that leap?
Look, I did economics at university. So I'm an economist by training, and one of the things that attracted me to infrastructure is again experience. The issue of the third runway at Kingston Smith and building a second airport at Badgerys Creek was an issue in my first campaign in 1996. It took us a while to get there, but we did get there.
Yeah.
In terms of
30 years, the first plane will land 30 years after our campaign.
So it's a, so my first speech when I got the infrastructure ministry on transport, my first speech in Parliament is largely about infrastructure. I think that, if you're serious about transforming the economy and society, then infrastructure is critical. I've had opportunities to change portfolio on a couple of occasions, and I've chosen not to.
Yeah.
I think also that there's a great deal of satisfaction in driving on a road that you have played a role in fixing. I mean, we transformed the Pacific Highway while I was the minister. John Howard's government put $1.3 billion in over 12 years. We put 7.6 in over 6.
That's quite a new. Well, as in from the time effectively that you were in the portfolio, it's quite new for the Commonwealth to take that much of an interest in roads, trains, things like that. Is that something that you're conscious of?
And we absolutely look. The biggest figure is that in public transport, we committed more in the time that I was infrastructure minister, in that 6 years, than had been committed by all federal governments in the previous 107 years, from 1901 right through to 2007. And that's a transformation. We did it by creating Infrastructure Australia. We did it by changing the way that federal funding was done for infrastructure projects. And there were some even in my party who were opposed to that. Some who said, if you start funding public transport, where will it end? You'll dip your toe in the water and you'll fall in and drown. Well, if you're serious about cities and urban congestion, public transport is the key. And so, going to projects like Regional Rail Link in Victoria, the Redcliffe Rail Line in Brisbane to the north, was first promised in 1895.
And every federal election since
every election was up it had come, federal and state, primarily state. We got it done, and it's opened, and it's fantastic. Gold Coast Light Rail, was opposed by the coalition, state and federal. They were happy to be there at the opening because it's a fantastic project. Noongar to Seaford extension in South Australia. The Perth City Link project, which has, if you want an example of a transformative project, it has united the North Bridge sort of entertainment precinct with the CBD of Perth. You have a massive private sector investment has gone on with new buildings and infrastructure there, the entertainment precinct. It's changed the face of Perth.
But so how do you prioritise those from Canberra? How does the Perth a road in Perth get prioritised over or below or balanced or in some way over a train in Brisbane or etc.?
That's why you need Infrastructure Australia to do that assessment,
right,
and to do it properly and objectively. There are a range of projects that I think would never have got up without the Infrastructure Australia process because of the previous political frame that was put on investment decisions. Perhaps the best example of that is the Majura Parkway in the ACT. $144 million from each level of government, from the ACT government and federally. What that has done is essentially mean that all the heavy vehicles don't have to go through the middle of Canberra. It's had a massive BCR, was either above 3 or 4, but substantial positive benefit. But no votes in it. No one has gone into a polling booth and said, I'm going to vote Labor because they fixed the Majura Parkway.
Can I just, that's a really interesting point, because that, there aren't, who the votes are attributed to is it's this complex mix that we have in Australia, where the state and federal governments can both be responsible, sometimes 50-50, sometimes 80-20. How do we decide how much the state should be investing, how much the federal government should be investing?
Sure, and I'm a supporter of partnership investing of 50-50 because I think unless you do that, what you have is if the states don't have buy-in, what you have is at the end of a project, you'll get a whole lot of artwork built because it's someone else's money, and you'll also get, as famously featured in one of the episodes of Utopia, you'll also have no discipline. So it became obvious to me that one state in particular used to always overestimate what the cost was and then come to you and say, aha, we have now $150 million left over from this project, and here's what we want to spend it on.
Right.
You prepared to name and shame? And
no, I'll be polite because I might be negotiating with them again soon. But it wasn't a Labor or a coalition issue. I mean, the bureaucracy, I reckon, just did this as a matter of course.
Sounds like the most sophisticated in the country if they're doing that.
Yeah.
Well, they certainly did, but.
So is that the rule of thumb then, 50-50? Because I don't think there is a right answer here.
Yeah, I just think that should be the starting point. There may be an argument from time to time over things like, the new airport. It's been done with an equity injection, and it's obviously a Commonwealth responsibility. Cross River Rail, our proposal there is 50-50 in terms of the cash injection, but a PPP model with essentially an availability payment model over 30 years, whereby the Commonwealth will guarantee a relatively small, modest payment, but over that period of time in recognition that the asset will be there at producing outcomes for a long period of time. So I think we need to be innovative in finances if it can work, whilst not having a view that some took in the current government somehow, that value capture was going to mean that you could do all these projects for free. That's a nonsense. But sometimes you can get that private sector investment, and the Commonwealth can play a role just in risk mitigation by providing some upfront payment.
I think so. There's the 50-50 issue, but then there's also what the states are aiming at in terms of their bids to the federal government. So, as you mentioned, when you were in government, there was a big focus on public transport, and more since all other governments since Federation combined. And then change of government, Tony Abbott had a view around only investing in roads from a federal perspective. Within the framework we've got, states find it quite hard to know what game they're playing,
and that can be a problem. I think one of the things that's happened though in recent years is that we've won that debate about post Malcolm Turnbull, which is a good thing. That was really ideological, and I think a rather extreme position that saw the private motor vehicle as embodying individualism and a train or a bus as embodying collectivism. So it's fortunately that's moved away, and now we have some bipartisan commitments over things like Metronet in Perth. You have the coalition since Malcolm Turnbull's took over as Prime Minister, not ruling out public transport projects, because what it did was it distorted what happened in the cities. There was money cut from Cross River Rail in Brisbane, Parramatta Epping Rail Link here in Sydney, Melbourne Metro, Perth Airport Link, Hobart Light Rail Study, all of it gone. Tonsley Park project in Adelaide, all of it removed, and then just put into roads, and that's a wrong position. Transport networks need to work together, road and rail, just as passenger and freight movement needs to work together as well. You need that integrated strategy.
So we'll come back to infrastructure in a minute, but you mentioned bipartisanship in Canberra. The other thing that's striking to outsiders around Canberra is this kind of Canberra bubble, that everything happens in Canberra, and there's such a focus during parliamentary sitting weeks on the healing Canberra. How do federal politicians stay in contact with the real world when you've got this navel gazing, as it appears from the outside, in on the hill?
I think getting out and about, but also by having getting about out and about as individuals, but also by setting up appropriate structures. So setting up Infrastructure Australia, setting up the Major Cities Unit, getting the right advice, making sure that we engage, dare I say it, with organisations like IPA and with the private sector. And I think I have had a long-standing record of having really constructive relationships with the business-based organisations in the sector. That doesn't mean we always agree, but it means that you have that dialogue and that contact. It is really easy, like you can get views reinforced, and that can happen on either side of politics. I think that if the Abbott government had have discussed issues more broadly, the idea of the Commonwealth not being involved in public transport, when Tony Abbott made that announcement, he made it in Melbourne on radio and said the Commonwealth don't invest in public transport projects. This was at a time where the regional rail link was nearing completion, the largest ever investment in a public transport project by the Commonwealth, one that had new stations at places like Tarneet and Wyndham Vale, which is exactly the way that planning should happen. The stations went there before the people.
At risk of opening Pandora's box, let's talk high-speed rail.
Yeah.
So it's the other rail line that gets promised around every federal election. You want to talk us through your current view on it?
Well, I'm a big supporter of it. I think it absolutely stacks up. We did the study, a two-part study. ACOM did the work for us, but it had engagement not just with national players but global players. It looked at international best practice. It found some principles of whether high-speed rail stacks up or not. What are the circumstances? One of the things that it found was that the journey, if it's 3 hours or under, was the critical thing that people were looking for. It just so happens that Sydney, Melbourne and Sydney, Brisbane. Yeah. So in terms of, if you look at the world's journeys, if you go any further than that, then people will tend to look just at air travel. But for that distance, and it's because if you combine up the time, like if we now wanted to go from this building to Melbourne CBD, it would take us more than 3 hours, door to door. Getting to the airport, booking through, going through security, waiting for the plane, getting on the plane, getting off the plane, getting a gate, doing all of that. And that by and large, of that 3 hours, most of it will be unproductive. Most of it. Some of it you might be able to read a document on the plane for the hour, now hour 35 minutes, hour 40 minutes. Interestingly, Sydney and Melbourne used to be an hour 20. It goes out by 5 minutes it now takes longer than it used to because of congestion.
I had Wi-Fi on my plane yesterday though, so it was a bit more productive than it used to be.
Well, bet you only used it for unproductive things, though.
I think I was texting you, actually.
that can also be a bit annoying, I've got to say. It's the one bit of downtime that you got. But you look at the time on a train, there's a reason why people catch the Eurostar from London to Paris, or go from, Rome to Milan,
So are you saying that 3 hours it still stacks up at 3 hours, or that's about the threshold?
It absolutely stacks up. If you got more than that, like if you wanted to go from Brisbane to Melbourne, you'd basically probably jump on the plane.
Yeah.
And the other thing that stacked up, the other thing that really pushed it over the positive barrier is regional economic development. A lot of talk about taking pressure off the big capital cities. If you're in Canberra, to take a city I'm familiar with, and you're under an hour from the CBD of Sydney, what that means is you can, I live in Marrickville. It can take you, 50 minutes to drive from Marrickville into the city. It's not very far. If you're an hour from, all of a sudden, you go to Sydney for dinner. You go to Sydney to see a show or a band and get home at night.
So you're looking to build a train line from your electorate office to your ministerial office. Is that fair to say?
This is the plan.
But so if you had, the more places you stop, of course, the slower it gets. So those two things undermine each other.
No. What it looked at having is two forms of transport is what makes it stack up. Your express trains, no stops, A to B, capital city to capital city, but then your regional trains at the same time.
So on an engineering transport base, I think most people see an attraction to high speed rail. Of course, the flip side of it is it was $114 billion in 20.
It was
there were a lot
very
of zeros
expensive.
involved.
It was a lot of money.
There
then
was.
The question is, if you had 100 and say it's 130 or 140 now, would you spend that on that? Is that a higher priority than metros in cities?
Well, that's over a long period of time, and it's also in terms of you can get some of that back in terms of this is an area where value capture can operate to receive some substantial income streams. All of a sudden, some of the places like in Canberra, Albury, Shepparton, Taree, Port Macquarie become transformed by that. So there's a real opportunity there. You also, the reason why it produced a positive return is the economic activity that would be generated by it. And one of the things that I've said we would do, and I've had legislation before the Parliament to create a high-speed rail authority, is we would also go to market. So we'd say to the players, and the costs I don't believe will have gone up. I think the costs will probably come down, because what's happening is that every continent on the planet, except for this one, every inhabited continent, they're not building it in Antarctica.
Yes, it's us against the penguins.
But the Americas, Asia certainly everywhere, Africa, as well as, of course, in Europe, an extensive rollout, are all building high-speed rail. And what's happening is that the technology is getting better and it's becoming cheaper. And so, one of the things that we've said that we would task the High-Speed Rail Authority with doing is, one, making sure preservation of the corridor. Two, and Infrastructure Australia have backed that up. Secondly, we would go to market and say, okay, who wants to partner with us in this? Now, here in this city of Sydney, the Japan Railway Company have had an office since the 1980s, waiting for something to happen. But also, TGV have visited here. from France. The Spanish have visited here. The Italians have visited here. The Chinese. You have, I think, the potential for a real opportunity and a real PPP to get a very good outcome. But I haven't hid from the fact that I think it will require a substantial government contribution as well.
So I think the thing we'd all agree on, though, is the preservation of the corridor is crucial if you're going to do it down the line, because otherwise the opportunity's lost because the tunnelling's too expensive.
Yep. And when the study was done, I think from memory, it was 82 kilometres of tunnels would be required. 67 kilometres of that tunnelling's here in Sydney.
Yeah.
I want to ask a slightly different question. We've seen quite often policies that are endorsed by, regardless of party, endorsed by that party when they're in office. Sometimes they get opposed after that when they're in opposition. I won't name any in particular, but it's something that seems to happen regularly. You have managed to avoid that in a lot of cases. You seem to stick to your convictions. What is it that how come you're able to do that, and how can we encourage a little bit more of that in our political discourse today?
Consistency. We did the work on the second Sydney airport as well. We looked at other sites. Take this for an example. We looked at other sites, including Wilton. And essentially what we came back to was that Badgerys Creek was the best site for a whole range of reasons. And that shouldn't have been all that surprising, because that had been what previous studies had found. But we genuinely looked at other options. There was a site up at Mangrove Mountain on the Central Coast that was worth looking at as well. It was a private sector proposal that came to us. We looked at that. We looked at Wilton. We looked at other options. Could you do something with Richmond to expand it? And we came back to Badgerys. We had discussions with coalition members, including Joe Hockey, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison. All of them were basically supportive of the proposal. We couldn't get, though, an agreement for Tony Abbott to not oppose it. And what would have happened would have been put forward. Abbott would have opposed it. Some in the Labor Party would have opposed it, and it would have been gone, that opportunity. So hence, it wasn't progressed any further than all of the work being done. But what that meant was that after the 2013 election, certainly I talked to Bill Shorten and told him that I'd had discussions because he wasn't in the cabinet at the time, that it was progressed under Julia Gillard as Prime Minister, and ensured that Joe Hockey was the key person in having discussions that it needed to be announced and progressed pretty quickly early in the term. And I supported it, and it's happening. Sometimes projects need bipartisanship. So it doesn't need a government decision, it needs a government and an opposition decision.
What about policies?
Well, in terms of policies, the same. One of the things that is dear to IPA is the issue of road pricing.
Exactly.
Now, I've agreed.
If the election happens to go your way, is that going to be a priority?
Well, it will be something that will progress in terms of looking at it. It won't be the first thing that we do. But what should happen is a bipartisan look at this issue. and it needs to be addressed. Even simple things that haven't been able to be progressed, like electric vehicles. Currently, if you're driving a 1977 Commodore, you're paying fuel tax. If you're driving a 2018 Tesla, you're not paying anything, and you're getting a discount on your registration.
Yeah, and you're not levitating, so you're using the road the same as everyone else.
That's not equity. And how something like that couldn't be progressed is beyond me. There's a whole lot of issues that should have been dealt with. There's an issue of freight at Sydney Airport with Qantas and Virgin both wanting to use larger aircraft, but which are more efficient. There'll be less of them, and they'll be quieter because they're newer aircraft, and the government hasn't had its act together to actually fix up the regulations to allow that to happen. I often feel like in recent years that I'm sort of a minister in exile, where business is sort of coming through my door saying, "Can you try and fix this for me?" And sometimes I have been able to. It must be said, fix issues with the government. But,
any you want to name?
No, I won't go into it. But that's what happens in part when you have a revolving door with different cabinet ministers, junior ministers, assistant ministers. I've shadowed at least 13 people.
So
in the last few years.
In government and in opposition, nearly a decade you've been in the infrastructure portfolio?
Yeah, longer, since December 2007. One of the things that I did as a minister in the different areas, for example, I created the Australian Council of Local Government. I brought in people who were not just mayors, but the peak organisations, including the managers, etc., to a body to get that input. On the Urban Policy Forum, we produced a national urban policy. I created an urban policy forum that met regularly. That included organisations like the Australian Architects, the Property Council, different business leaders, as well as some of the key mayors, the Planning Institute of Australia, getting those people around a room. I made sure, in terms of the Infrastructure Australia board, we had, from this organisation, Mark Birrell appointed, so that what that did was bring in the engagement of IPA and its affiliates into the organisation.
And you had Sir Rod Eddington, who's now our chair-elect.
Yeah, Sir Rod Eddington, an amazing chair of Infrastructure Australia.
So do you consider Infrastructure Australia to be your legacy from your first ministerial role in this portfolio?
I think the fact that it's been maintained. It was opposed, bear in mind, when we put it up before the Parliament. This was not a bipartisan proposition. And it was a great success, I think. It needs to be. I think its significance isn't the same as what it was, but that can happen again, I think, with the right approach. I think that was a very important legacy. One, I think the change in terms of urban policy, the re-engagement with cities, is another thing that now looks a bit ho-hum, but it was a very significant transformation and change that, again, has subsequently become permanent. The support for public transport investment has become permanent. The first aviation white paper, so that we had a 30-year plan. You look at where aviation is today in 2019, go back and have a look at where it was in 2007.
I'm interested, all the things you've mentioned as legacies are policy things, they're not project things.
Yeah, but the projects I'm concerned about, are there as well. But
It's not a bad thing, by the way.
No,
I don't think
I
Adrian's-
compliment
it's
it.
not pejorative.
It's just
the
an
Pacific
interesting
Highway, because it's not about, look, you can do a project one-off, but and that's important. The Pacific Highway has saved lives. We rebuilt 1/3 of the interstate rail freight network, as part of the economic stimulus plan. A massive change and transformation in efficiency. Some of the little projects, fixing up, we had 5,500 community infrastructure projects as part of the economic stimulus. Be it big projects, Gold Coast Stadium, or the little projects, fixing up the local oval so kids get, my local field at Mackey Park in Marrickville, that used to be shut down for 5 months of the year when the soccer season ended. Couldn't be used in summer because they had to regenerate. Now they're able to play cricket and all of that. Those little things bring you a great deal of satisfaction, and they're right around the country.
So if you get a shot, then there's a federal election in May. If you're successful and prevail and you're in the infrastructure portfolio, what do you want to be your legacy from the next run at?
Well, I think high-speed rail is one of the things, because I think that's transformative. That's a project, but it's more than just a project.
Delivering high-speed rail or putting the foundations?
Look, the truth is it won't be built. Delivering a structure that makes it bipartisan into the future. So advancing the corridor preservation, I would like us to be advanced in terms of how it's going to be built and potential partners for there to be a clear pathway. We've got the study, so we've got the basics are there. I think in shipping, I think is critical. Look, we did good shipping reform. Shipping reform was too hard. We changed the Navigation Act 1912, which had in it that literally that you could shoot a lunatic, was actually in the act, without fear of prosecution, because it was taken from the Westminster Act from the 19th century, where people would go crazy on board and ship captain might have to.
I think it's bizarre that you'd name the mode of why you can shoot them. Seems like a really odd, oddly specific.
It was in there. You were free from prosecution.
Now you're telling me
for taking action, and there were all sorts of really strange things in there that had just been put in the too hard basket for 100 years. Now we consulted really broadly to try and revitalise Australian shipping, and the truth is the coalition said before it came into being in 2012, the coalition immediately said they'd get rid of it. So you didn't have the investment because you didn't have the policy certainty there. A bit like energy policy now, you need policy certainty for that investment. We had a policy now, a clear policy of creating a strategic fleet. The fact is that Australia's down to 14 Australian flag vessels. Switzerland has more. Doesn't have any oceans, obviously, either. We need to do much better as an island nation, an island continent. So that's one of the areas that I'd be looking to make a legacy on.
What about for IA?
For IA, I want to see it at the centre of the debate.
Should they have money?
Much more than so it is now. No, but I think that they should have, they shouldn't be a funding body, because once you do that, you'll distort their actions.
Okay.
What they should do, though, is have circumstances whereby they have power over decision making. So not
because they've got the infrastructure priority list now.
Yeah, that's why we have government, to make decisions. Part of what we have to do is to stop the distortion that's there in terms of a politicisation.
Should IA be driving policy in some way? Or
IA should be driving policy, and there are examples whereby it has, including in recent years.
Absolutely.
I think the preservation of the corridor policy was some of the best work that it's done. I think it should be looking at issues including financing options, which it's provided for. We've said very clearly we'll get rid of the infrastructure financing unit, whatever it's called these days. But that's the job of IA.
Do you see any
We'll give that money to IA and to the major cities unit.
Do you see any similarity between when the National Competition Policy paid states on the condition that certain reforms were implemented? Do you see any similar possibilities for IA?
Oh, look, there's a potential for doing that. And there's a potential for making sure, for example, one of the things that we'll look at in government is a way that you ensure that priority projects get funding before projects determined on the basis of politics. Now, there are a range of ways that you can do that. We did it just out of political will. So we funded every single priority project. But Goodwood to Torrens, managed motorways programs, Hunter Expressway, projects that there was no political imperative to do so. We did it. And the Cabinet understood, because Infrastructure Australia was, our creation, and because you had serious people. I mean, Sir Rod Eddington is a remarkable Australian, and he's someone who has weight, and that makes a difference when you have that drive from the top.
I'm really conscious of your time, being really generous with your time. I've got one final question. What's your favourite sort of infrastructure and why? Probably rail, just because I think that there's something about getting on a train, whether you're a millionaire or a pensioner, you get the same seat.
Unless you're in high-speed rail and get a first-class one.
Well, it's not much better, the experience. That's the truth. It just shows you got more money than you need.
All right, thank you ever so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
My
Thanks
pleasure.
for being on. So that was Albo, the Shadow Minister for Transport and Infrastructure. A great discussion, I thought, and he certainly got some fascinating insights on infrastructure policy and politics more broadly as well.
I couldn't agree more, and to be honest, I did enjoy the discussion, but separate from any thoughts on politics or policy, I'm always impressed when speaking with Albo that there's clearly no other version of him behind closed doors. He's the same guy in public as he is in private.
I think we saw that authenticity, and he spoke a lot about his background and what politicised him, and why he tackles policy issues the way he does. I think that authenticity came through today.
Very, very came through loud and clear. It was great to have him here. On a slightly different note, though, we've just had an election in New South Wales, and Adrian, I'd certainly be interested to know your thoughts on what the implications are of that election for infrastructure investment in the state.
Both the opposition and the government ran fairly strongly on an infrastructure platform. A lot of the discussion around the election in the campaign was around infrastructure. At Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, we put together a blue book and a red book, and the blue book was the one that was used as a Liberal government were returned. So that tells the sector about what's happened. You can get the video on our social media channels.
Can we get a little summary of that? What were the key takeaways?
So I think infrastructure was clearly a deciding issue in the election. The striking thing for me is actually looking at New South Wales and Victoria. And looking at the two most recent elections, they've both been run on platforms of a substantial infrastructure spend, and I think that should be instructive for both sides at the federal level around infrastructure is a key issue in the electorate, and governments that have a good story to tell on infrastructure are finding electoral success. Interesting.
Well, it's certainly a great time to be involved in the sector, and it's good to see that infrastructure continues to be a focus for governments of all stripes. Pleasing for us, those of us that work in it, and certainly for those of us that use it as well.
Absolutely. For our listeners, we hope you'll share this podcast with your colleagues and anyone you think might be interested. We've had a pretty positive response to the podcast so far, but we're always keen to get your feedback and suggestions for how we can improve it.
So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you to the Honourable Anthony Albanese for joining us today. Thank you, Adrian, for hosting with me, and we'll be back again soon. So please make sure to subscribe so that you're notified when there's a new episode.
Thanks, Ilya.
Thanks, Adrian.
Inside Infrastructure is an Infrastructure Partnerships Australia podcast sponsored by PwC Australia.